Why does half of Colorado feel crowded and busy, while the other half looks almost empty on the map? What invisible forces pushed millions of people east of the Rockies, leaving vast western lands sparsely populated despite their beauty and resources? From towering mountain walls to hidden climate lines and water scarcity, this divide wasn't an accident. It was shaped by geography, survival, and quiet decisions made over generations. Stay with us, because the real reason Western Colorado never filled up challenges what we think determines where people can actually live. The fortress nobody wanted. You probably imagine the Appalachian Mountains as just a scenic stretch of hills and forests, a place hikers wander and photographers love. But these rugged ridges were more than just nature's artwork. They were a fortress, a line so formidable that, for centuries, it acted like an invisible wall across early America. European settlers didn't want to cross it. Native tribes had lived on either side for centuries, and the mountains themselves seemed to protect a natural order. Yet, as stubborn pioneers began to carve trails and push through valleys, something unexpected happened. Crossing that line didn't just change the map, it split the cultural and political identity of a nation still finding its legs. Those early footsteps, those crude log cabins perched on hillsides, laid the groundwork for divisions that echo in today's elections and cultural debates. How could a mountain range, just rocks and trees, quietly shape the fate of an entire country? By the late 18th century, the Appalachians weren't just a physical barrier, they were a test of character, a trial by elevation. Settlers who dared cross often found themselves isolated, cut off from trade, news, and government. What survived here was grit and independence, a culture that valued self-reliance and suspicion of authority. On the other side, in the lowlands and fertile river valleys, a very different America was taking shape. Wealthier, more connected, politically active. You can see the split even in voting patterns today, in how towns and counties fall into distinct political categories. What's remarkable is that no law, no government decree created this division. It was the geography itself, the slow, steady grind of the terrain, that carved these cultural trenches. Roads followed valleys, rivers determined settlements, and suddenly, the land itself was an architect of identity. Mountains became political boundaries long before anyone had cast a ballot. The twist? These same mountains, stubborn and unforgiving, almost stopped America from expanding west at all. The nation's destiny teetered on the balance of a few dozen trails and the courage or madness of settlers willing to risk disease, starvation, and conflict with native tribes. Their accidental crossings set a pattern. The east stayed orderly, the west became wild, and the middle ground, right over the ridges, turned into a battleground of ideas, culture, and economy. Every log cabin, every cleared field, every stubborn little town in the Appalachians was a brick in a wall that nobody realized they were building. While these mountains shaped centuries of political and cultural conflict, they also raised a question. If elevation could divide a nation so profoundly, could water achieve the opposite? Or would it spark conflicts even more bitter than the ones mountains had created? The river that flows backward. You might think rivers always know which way to go. Downhill, toward the sea. Simple, predictable, not the Chicago River. In 1900, engineers accomplished what seemed impossible. They turned a river upside down, literally. Using a massive feat of human ingenuity and hubris, they reversed its flow, sending water that had naturally traveled toward Lake Michigan away from it instead. Why? Because the city's sewage had become a deadly threat, fouling drinking water and spreading disease at an alarming rate. The solution seemed straightforward: redirect the filth away from Lake Michigan and save the city. But this wasn't just plumbing. It was a move that set off a century-long feud with the state of Michigan, sparked legal battles, and left engineers scrambling to convince everyone that redirecting nature was worth the risk. Could one river's course really hold so much power over politics, health, and the fate of a city? History almost forgot the audacity of this project. Chicago's engineers dug a canal deeper than most imagined possible, cutting through miles of earth to wrest control from nature itself. Workers toiled under brutal conditions, shoveling tons of dirt, blasting rock, and rerouting what seemed like an unstoppable force. When the river finally obeyed, Water gushed backward, a spectacle that astonished the public and terrified neighboring states. Michigan saw their Great Lakes being stolen, prompting lawsuits and interstate tension that lasted decades. Chicago, on the other hand, celebrated the triumph of human engineering over natural limits, proudly touting itself as a city that refused to be conquered by its environment. But the story went beyond water or courts. It was a glimpse of America's emerging belief that humans could rewrite nature to serve their own needs. Yet that same arrogance carried consequences nobody foresaw, from flooding to ecological changes that ripple to this day. Most intriguing is how a river, usually a quiet, obedient part of the landscape, became a symbol of conflict, ambition, and hubris. By controlling the Chicago River, the city didn't just solve a sewage problem, it reshaped trade routes, influenced urban development, and highlighted the fragile balance between human ambition and the natural world. Streets, buildings, and communities were now arranged around a river flowing the wrong way, a daily reminder that civilization can bend nature but never entirely escape its consequences. And just as the river challenged its surroundings, another invisible force was shaping America quietly, almost imperceptibly. If engineers could reverse a river's flow with concrete and steel, what about forces no human hand could touch? Invisible lines drawn by climate itself that determined where crops would grow and where entire regions would turn to dust? The invisible wall across America. Imagine a line drawn across a vast empty plain, invisible to the eye, yet decisive in shaping human destiny. This line exists. It's called the 100th meridian. On maps, it's just a faint stroke, a numerical marker for longitude. But in reality, it's a boundary that determines where towns thrive, where farms fail, and where civilization hesitates. Step west of it, and rainfall drops, the soil dries, and the landscape seems less forgiving. Step east, and rivers are plentiful, soil is rich, and life feels almost effortless. For centuries, pioneers and settlers unknowingly obeyed this boundary, planting crops that would thrive or perish, and building towns that would grow into bustling cities or disappear into ghostly ruins. Have you ever wondered why the Great Plains are sparsely populated compared to the Mississippi Valley? This invisible line is the reason. Farmers and city planners learned the hard way that rainfall isn't just a background detail, it's the lifeblood of survival. Just a few inches of precipitation make the difference between fertile farmland and barren dust. Early settlers pushing westward often thought they could tame the land, only to face repeated crop failures that forced them back east. Towns sprouted near the line, barely holding on, while others collapsed entirely. Cities like Omaha and Wichita sit just on the eastern side, benefiting from enough water to sustain growth, whereas communities further west struggled for decades. The invisible barrier didn't need walls, gates, or soldiers. It was simply climate itself asserting authority. While humans build dams, canals, and highways, nothing can move the meridian. It governs the possibilities of life, quietly but relentlessly over centuries. Farmers adapted with irrigation, cities invested in reservoirs, and yet the line remained an immovable governor of fate, an unseen boundary no political maneuver could erase. The 100th meridian is more than just geography. It's a mirror reflecting human ambition and limitation. Engineers, economists, and historians have all tried to understand it, searching for patterns in rainfall, soil, and population density. Patterns emerge that are almost eerie. East of the meridian, landscapes teem with farms, railroads, and settlements. West, the horizon stretches emptily, dotted only with small, resilient towns. Climate scientists now warn that the line is shifting eastward due to global warming, pushing precipitation patterns and water availability further into what were once reliable regions. This subtle migration threatens communities that have thrived for over a century, towns where generations farmed the land, only to now face the possibility of drought, depopulation, and economic collapse. The invisible wall that once shaped settlement patterns is moving, and the consequences are profound. Water scarcity is no longer a distant possibility, it's already reshaping lives. What makes this boundary even more compelling is the human response to it. People stubbornly resist nature's rules, building irrigation systems, pumping water from aquifers, and constructing infrastructure to cheat the meridian's limits. Cities like Denver and Amarillo exist because humans engineered solutions, diverting rivers, drilling wells, and creating reservoirs. Yet even these efforts are temporary. The line remains an observer, watching as society experiments with its environment. And with climate change accelerating, even the best-laid plans are under pressure. Farmers who once relied on predictable rainfall patterns now gamble against uncertainty. Urban planners must rethink city placement, and policymakers wrestle with a shifting map of opportunity and risk. The invisible wall, once static and predictable, is now a moving, living challenge, shaping the economic and social fabric of an entire region. It's striking to realize that such a simple concept, a line on a map, can carry so much power. Rivers were redirected, mountains shaped culture, but rainfall drew borders without a single hand ever touching it. It influences politics, economy, and human survival, determining where America's future could bloom or wither. Scientists track its movement, engineers attempt to bend it, but ultimately, it's a boundary humanity must respect, just as settlers once learned to respect the mountains or rivers that define their lives. This invisible wall reminds us that nature has rules, and those who ignore them do so at their peril. Yet while this boundary commands respect, there are places where human ambition intersects with faraway, untouched land, territories the government itself seems to want forgotten, hidden from plain sight. If an invisible climate line could dictate the fate of millions across the plains, what about lands so remote that entire nations could own them, yet never truly possess them? Places where isolation itself becomes the ultimate barrier. These forgotten lands, remote and almost mythical in their isolation, exist like paradoxes, owned yet uninhabited, valuable yet worthless. Palmyra Atoll, thousands of miles away in the Pacific, is one such place. The U.S. claims it, yet no one lives there permanently. Its tropical beauty contrasts sharply with the harsh, shifting plains of the 100th meridian, yet both landscapes share a hidden truth. Humans can claim, cultivate, or cross land, but nature ultimately writes the final rules. Why does one place flourish while another languishes? Understanding these forces is crucial because it reveals the limits of human planning, the stubbornness of geography, and the way unseen patterns control our destiny. And as people grapple with water scarcity, migration, and the changing environment, another story emerges. One about the hidden, often forgotten pieces of America itself, where decisions of ownership and habitability collide in strange, almost surreal ways. The island America forgot it owned. Most people couldn't point to Palmyra Atoll on a map, and even fewer know it exists. Floating in the vast Pacific Ocean, about halfway between Hawaii and American Samoa, it's a tiny speck of land with an outsized story. Unlike other U.S. territories bustling with life, Palmyra has no permanent population. Zero. Zip. Nada. And yet, it's officially American soil, incorporated but unorganized, a paradox that confuses even historians. Scientists flock here to study coral reefs and wildlife, while lawyers argue over its ownership. Obscure legal loopholes have made it simultaneously priceless and worthless. Imagine land that the U.S. government wants to claim, but no one really wants to live on. How does a patch of sand ringed by waves and palms end up more mysterious than the world's largest cities? And what secrets can an empty island hold that a metropolis can't? Back in the early 20th century, Palmyra seemed poised to be a valuable asset. Coconut plantations, copper harvesting, and strategic positioning in the Pacific tempted developers and even the Navy. Ambitious settlers tried to tame the land, imagining a tropical utopia where crops would flourish and trade would thrive. But every attempt failed spectacularly. Hurricanes swept in with terrifying ferocity, washing away buildings, tearing apart fragile plantations, and leaving settlers stranded. Supplies ran out. Isolation became a trap. Without easy access to medicine, food, or communication, survival itself turned into a gamble. The federal government eventually stepped in, declaring Palmyra off-limits to the public and curbing private claims. Even during World War II, when nearby Pacific islands were turned into military fortresses, Palmyra's role was minimal, a staging post at best, a ghostly witness to battles elsewhere. Over time, it became a symbol of what America could claim but not control, a territory almost forgotten except by a few cartographers, dedicated scientists, and conspiracy theorists. The island quietly reminds us that sometimes national power stretches further than human ambition can reach, and that some places remain untouchable, not because they're unimportant, but because nature and isolation refuses to be tamed. Its legal status is equally peculiar. Unlike Hawaii, Guam, or Puerto Rico, Palmyra has no voters, no cities, no infrastructure, yet it is incorporated U.S. territory. This has led to a strange tug-of-war over rights, resources, and oversight. Corporations, environmentalists, and government agencies have all cast covetous eyes toward the atoll. Rich fish stocks, unique coral reefs, and the promise of tropical timber make it a hidden treasure. Access is tightly controlled, however, and even scientists must navigate a maze of permits to step foot on the island. Ironically, its emptiness preserves it, turning neglect into a kind of accidental protection. The atoll has become a living laboratory, a snapshot of untouched nature, where seabirds thrive and coral reefs flourish without human interference. It's as if the island is teaching a lesson. Sometimes the best way to protect value is to leave it alone entirely. Palmyra's story also carries a psychological weight. There's something deeply haunting about a place that belongs to a nation but is almost never touched by it. It sits in solitude, waves breaking over its shores, far from modern life, technology, or governance. The silence is deafening. The emptiness invites questions. What if other American territories, remote lands, or hidden resources are being overlooked? What if the next great ecological or economic treasure is lying dormant, waiting for attention, yet forbidden by circumstance? This tension between presence and absence, between ownership and abandonment, paints a picture of power that is both fragile and absolute. Palmyra exists on the edge of maps, in the shadows of history, reminding us that control isn't the same as possession. Palmyra's story of isolation, forgotten value, and unintended consequences foreshadows another kind of human-made barrier closer to home. If nature's isolation could render an American territory virtually uninhabitable despite legal ownership, could human decisions, lines drawn on blueprints in distant offices, doom entire communities that had thrived for generations simply by choosing which road went where? The highway that killed a region. Few roads carry more than just vehicles, they carry consequences. When Interstate 40 sliced through the Appalachian Mountains in the 1960s, engineers were focused on efficiency, on connecting 2 points with the shortest line and least expense. What they didn't account for was the human geography they were carving through. Entire communities, thriving or barely surviving, suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of progress. Towns bypassed by the highway watched as commerce, visitors, and opportunity drained away. Places only 30 miles apart ended up in drastically different worlds. One flourished with new motels, restaurants, and gas stations. The other slowly emptied, the hum of life replaced by silence. This wasn't an accident of fate, it was the highway's design, a concrete scar etched into the Appalachian heartland, shaping prosperity and poverty in ways no blueprint could fully capture. Development didn't wait for consent. The highway funneled trade to some towns while starving others. Businesses that relied on passing traffic found themselves invisible, their lifeblood rerouted to bypass exits in larger cities. Local economies, once diversified and self-sufficient, became fragile. Small towns that had survived generations of logging, mining, and agriculture now faced a new kind of threat: economic isolation. Families who had lived in these valleys for decades watched children leave, schools close, and shops shutter. What was meant to be a road of progress became an executioner for whole communities. Engineers rarely visited the towns they were shaping, drawing lines on maps from offices far away, oblivious to the lives being redirected. The highway didn't just move cars, it moved destinies, pulling some communities forward while leaving others to decay in quiet resignation. The human cost of this infrastructural decision became visible over decades. Once thriving towns became ghostly reminders of what happens when geography and planning collide without empathy. Appalachia's isolation, once romanticized as rugged independence, turned into systemic neglect. Opportunities evaporated, and generations grew up knowing that their hometowns were no longer on the map of progress. Yet the highway also tells a deeper story about power and control. Roads are not neutral. The planners, government officials, and investors held immense influence, deciding which regions would prosper and which would languish. Their choices echoed the broader inequalities of the era, showing how infrastructure, something often seen as a public good, can amplify divisions, entrench poverty, and reshape culture for decades. It's worth observing the contrast between towns that flourished and those that withered. A community with a well-placed exit could transform overnight. New businesses, rising property values, and a sense of connection to the national economy. Meanwhile, a town a few miles further, cut off from the highway, faced economic stagnation. Residents adapted in ways both creative and heartbreaking. Some turned to subsistence farming or local crafts, others abandoned their homes entirely in search of opportunity elsewhere. The highway's trajectory became almost prophetic, a concrete scar predicting which towns would survive and which would disappear. What's chilling is that these outcomes weren't inevitable. They were chosen, drafted on maps, and executed with precision. Geography alone didn't doom these towns. Human decisions, disguised as engineering solutions, did. The social consequences were equally profound. Communities lost not just money, but identity. Schools shrank as families moved away. Churches emptied, civic engagement faltered. The very soul of towns, intertwined with local businesses, festivals, and daily interactions, eroded. Appalachia's culture, long celebrated for resilience and self-reliance, was put under stress like never before. People who had prided themselves on endurance faced a new reality. Survival depended not on grit or skill, but on being in the right place at the right time, positioned on the map to catch the flow of cars and commerce. Generations grew up aware that infrastructure could empower or erase a community, and that lesson reverberates today whenever new highways, rail lines, or urban developments reshape lives without consulting those who inhabit the land. Beyond economics, the highway illustrates the subtle ways in which progress can hide destruction. Interstate 40 wasn't just asphalt and concrete, it was a statement about priorities. Modernity demanded speed, efficiency, and connectivity, and those ideals overshadowed local needs. Decisions were justified in terms of national interest, federal funding, and logistical convenience. Yet for those living along the Appalachian corridor, the highway became a symbol of abandonment, a line that divided opportunity, echoing the invisible walls and natural barriers that have shaped America's past. Roads, like rivers or mountains, have power beyond their function. They determine where life thrives, where it struggles, and how communities evolve or dissolve. Looking back, it's impossible to separate the highway from the broader story of Appalachia. Its impact is tangible in empty storefronts, abandoned streets, and communities struggling to survive. The lesson is clear. Even the most well-intentioned infrastructure carries consequences, often unforeseen, shaping not just land, but people's futures. Interstate 40's path reminds us that progress is rarely neutral, and that every line drawn on a map holds a human story, waiting to unfold. And if roads could wield such transformative and destructive power, what about the hidden forces beneath the surface? Water, climate, and geography have always been shaping life, just as unseen as this highway, quietly deciding which regions rise and which fall. The mysteries of America's terrain continue, leading us from concrete scars to coastlines and the paradoxes hidden along them. If a single highway could determine which towns lived and which died, could something as fundamental as temperature create the same stark divide, turning one coastline into a metropolis while leaving another, far richer in resources, virtually empty? The coastline paradox. Stretching from icy fjords to temperate bays, Alaska's coastline is a marvel. It's the longest in the United States, yet it feels almost empty, a wilderness untouched by urban life. Few people live here despite the staggering resources buried beneath its frozen shores: oil, gas, fish, and minerals worth trillions. The reason isn't obvious. It's not a lack of ambition. Humans have tried, but the climate imposes strict limits. Extreme cold, shifting ice, and relentless storms make infrastructure costly, supply chains fragile, and settlements difficult to maintain. Unlike warmer, smaller coasts where cities exploded over centuries, Alaska's environment demands resilience few can afford. Nature sets the terms, and human ambition bends but rarely conquers. Contrast this with New Jersey, a tiny strip of coastline packed with nearly 9 million people. Beaches, ports, industrial hubs, and cities crowd every inch, forming a dense, bustling landscape. The difference isn't just geography, it's temperature. A mere 10 degrees warmer can transform an inhospitable coast into a thriving metropolis. Accessibility, moderate climate, and fertile ground create conditions for commerce, housing, and industry to flourish. While Alaska's shores promise wealth and resources, New Jersey's offer immediate opportunity. Land that can be settled, built upon, and turned into profit without heroic engineering or near impossible logistics. It's a paradox. Abundance in raw materials doesn't guarantee prosperity, while scarcity in size doesn't prevent explosive growth. The story of these coastlines isn't just about numbers, it's about human choices, risk, and adaptation. Settlers, developers, and governments have long confronted this imbalance, making strategic decisions about where to invest and where to leave nature largely untouched. In Alaska, towns like Anchorage or Juneau exist because ingenuity overcame environmental hurdles. Roads carved from mountains, ports engineered to survive ice, and systems built to endure extreme cold. Even then, most of the coast remains wild, unpopulated, a reminder of how climate governs settlement. People flock to coasts that offer convenience and comfort, leaving resource-rich areas untouched, waiting for technology or desperation to force humanity's hand. The paradox also reflects the limits of economic logic. Exploiting Alaska's resources isn't impossible, but it requires risk, investment, and tolerance for hardship. Companies weigh potential profits against environmental challenges, labor costs, and logistical nightmares. For New Jersey, development is almost frictionless. Goods move freely, infrastructure exists, and climate doesn't command daily survival. These contrasts highlight a hidden truth. Natural abundance alone doesn't determine human success. Settlement patterns follow opportunity, accessibility, and climate more than raw resources, a lesson repeated across history in rivers, mountains, and plains. It's worth considering what lies beneath Alaska's frozen waves, trillions in wealth, waiting for a time when extraction is feasible. The contrast is stark. One coastline thrives despite limited resources, the other remains largely untouched despite unimaginable riches. It challenges assumptions about how humans interact with nature. Prosperity isn't always about what's there, it's about what humans can use, access, and sustain. And as the climate shifts and technology evolves, these patterns may change again. Perhaps the empty northern shores will one day teem with life, or perhaps they will remain a testament to nature's authority. The coastline paradox reveals something deeper about the relationship between humans and the land. Opportunity is never evenly distributed, and geography quietly governs our choices. For centuries, Americans have followed warmth, accessibility, and convenience, shaping cities, industries, and lifestyles. Yet hidden in the cold, the remote, and the challenging lies potential, untouched, vast, and waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. And just as coastlines determine the flow of human settlement, tunnels beneath rivers have reshaped the future of transportation, urban life, and dependence on cars. If climate alone could explain why one coast thrived while another sat empty despite its wealth, could a single tunnel, burrowed beneath a river, reshape an entire nation's way of living, moving, and building communities for the next century? The tunnel that changed everything. Beneath the busy streets of Manhattan and the industrial hum of Jersey City lies a marvel few pause to appreciate: the Holland Tunnel. Opened in 1927, it wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a revolution. Engineers solved the deadly problem of carbon monoxide buildup in long, confined tunnels, pioneering ventilation systems still studied today. Vehicles could now pass safely under the Hudson River, connecting two massive urban centers with unprecedented ease. On the surface, it seemed like progress in motion, a solution to traffic congestion and commerce, but the tunnel's effects went far beyond mere transportation. It quietly reshaped the way Americans would live, work, and move for generations. Suddenly, commuting became practical on a scale never imagined. Middle-class families began leaving cramped city apartments for newly built suburbs, chasing space, greenery, and the promise of modern life. Neighborhoods that once relied on local business for survival now looked outward, dependent on highways and tunnels for daily needs. The tunnel didn't just connect two cities, it connected lifestyles. Public transit, once the backbone of urban life, began its slow decline. Streetcars, ferries, and trains lost passengers to cars that flowed freely beneath the river. Cities expanded outward, suburbs sprawled into farmland, and the American dream took on a new car-centric shape. Few realized that an engineering solution had inadvertently altered the nation's entire approach to urban planning and mobility. The social and economic ripples were immense. Real estate markets boomed in suburban areas, while city centers adjusted to declining foot traffic. Families gained space, schools, and yards, but cities paid a price. Denser neighborhoods emptied, public transit systems weakened, and congestion eventually shifted rather than disappeared. Entire patterns of commerce and daily life were rewritten overnight. Even culture changed. Weekend drives, shopping trips, and suburban lifestyles redefined how Americans spent time, built communities, and envisioned success. The tunnel symbolized human ingenuity, but also revealed a truth. Solving one problem often creates another, and progress rarely comes without compromise. The Holland Tunnel, a triumph of engineering, became an architect of suburban sprawl, car dependency, and the reshaping of metropolitan America. Outcomes that no one explicitly planned, yet that continue to influence the nation today, still felt every time someone enters a car and heads toward the suburbs rather than the city center. Did the role of mountains, water, and climate change how you see Colorado's population divide? Do you think technology could ever reverse this imbalance, or has geography already made its final decision? Let us know which factor surprised you the most.